After what is turning into a contested election on February 25th, Nigeria has a president-elect. Bola Ahmed Tinubu has been elected the next president of Africa's largest economy. A former senator and a former two-term governor of Lagos State, Tinubu will have his work cut out for him when he takes over in May 2023. Nigeria's annual gross domestic product growth rate slowed to 3.10% in 2022 compared to 3.40% in 2021. However, the economy did grow by 3.52% year-on-year in real terms in the fourth quarter of last year compared to 2.25% in the previous quarter. Africa's largest economy is facing several economic challenges that its next president will have to take on. And in what some have described as the world's toughest job, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, many are wondering if he's up to the task. Joining me now is Gospel Obele, Chief Economist at Streetnomics. Gospel, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you once again for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Tolu.
Many have asked why anyone would really want to be president of Nigeria at this time, given the economic challenges and the situation the country finds itself in. So, Gospel, let's start with that. Sort of paint a picture for the audience and for us in terms of where things stand economically right now for Nigeria.
Thank you. Yes, economically speaking now in Nigeria, things are not so good. In fact, safe to say that the economy is largely distressed on many grounds. Unemployment is high. There's the full scarcity challenge in one way or the other. There is still a lot of monetary economic issues that need to be dealt with around naira, the value of the currency, the productivity dynamics, in the Nigerian economy. There are still major sectoral focused issues, like power and energy. MSMEs are still having a difficult time, trying to stay liquid, trying to scale their business and develop their markets. Technically, also, markets are not yet developed in the real context of not just informal and formal markets, but also expanding the opportunities made available to, all economic stakeholders, including the vulnerable segment of the Nigerian economy. The price of bread is still very high, meaning that food inflation is still very high. So, and there are technically more insecurity risks than ever before. And as a result of the current election dynamics around the elections, insecurity tensions have also hiked. Foreign direct investors are a bit skeptical, around investing in Nigeria at this time, especially in this current year. So there are so many challenges that we are currently seeing. Debt is very high. Government spending has not yielded much results. We still have a core major revenue issue right now in Nigeria, and drastic investments need to go into the productive drivers or the productive sectors in order. So technically, Nigeria is in a very, very, very bad state right now. And it will require very visionary leadership to turn it around. But despite all of these narratives, we've also seen that the opportunities are very, very obvious. The opportunities for our markets to scale are obvious. The opportunities for our SMEs, to do more in terms of export and exchange with the global and regional market is still very high. Young Nigerians are increasingly growing more resiliently within the context of getting their talents, their gifts, their expressions, and in exchange for commercial value. So we're seeing that growth in the freelance market, growth in the service sector, which currently holds about 52% of the Nigerian GDP. So there are a huge pack of opportunities. A lot of Nigerian SMEs are export ready, but they cannot find access to markets, to yield that FX receipt and also growth for Nigerian businesses home and abroad. So we have what it takes, both structurally, both in terms of human capital, in terms of the opportunities, in terms of the resilient and entrepreneurial efforts of Nigeria to make more for our country that we're currently doing. And let's not forget Nigerians in diaspora who are increasingly, doing more in the diasporal economy. And we can sort of begin to close the gap between our interactions with Nigerians in diaspora and begin to look at how foreign remittances, can be not just a source of revenue, but a strategic pipeline to invest in strategic sector and strategic human capital endeavors back home. So the pack of opportunities are very interesting, but they are locked in very interesting uncertainties as well. So not as though it's a trade-off, but it's also a complex reality to deal.
Okay, so I'm going to sneak this question in very quickly because we saw the naira redesign policy come up right before this election. President Buhari coming out with his full chest, as Nigerians would say, to own the decision and saying it was aimed at curbing vote buying. Now, the presidential election has gone away. We still have the state governorship elections on March 11th, but Tinubu will not take over until May, and he has said he would reverse the policy. By then, the policy would have breathed and lived a few months. Do you still see a possible return to bringing back some of the old currency in May 2023 when Tinubu takes over?
Well, I think the event post-March 11th till May, would go a long way to determine. So, I mean, since the president owned up that it was as a result of vote buying, now that the elections are almost over, we want to see what the next steps are, monetarily speaking, in terms of making the new notes readily available. Because, I mean, whether we like it or not, the new notes have gone into the mainstream, but there are still old notes in the hands of people. All right. So what I see likely happen is that probably a policy to relax, that exchange effort, that demand supply dynamics, and so as to encourage some form of cold circulation, and maybe over time, fizzle out the old notes. If the priority is still to sort of fizzle out the old note, but then it will become a bit interesting or funny to hear that there's going to be a complete reversal of the policy, because it also has its own impact, monetarily speaking.
Yes.
Let's not forget that there are a lot of monies were in circulation. Let's not forget that there's a lot of counterfeit old notes and all that. So those are the valid national security focus risk that the current administration were trying to curb, in as much as, yes, the mode of executing the policy was quite worrisome, but those are valid concerns. So the conversation will now be, how would the new administration deal with those valid concerns in a bid to sort of relax the pressure? And that's on the assumption that after post-elections, prior to May 2023, the CBN hasn't done enough in making the new notes available in the economy yet.
All right, so let's move on to something else that we talk about when it comes to Nigeria a lot. We saw debt servicing overtake revenue in 2022, and there is the potential for that to happen yet again this year. Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed revealed that Nigeria spends 80% of its taxes and its revenue paying off outstanding debt. In January, the Debt Management Office said Nigeria's next president would inherit no less than 77 trillion naira as debt after President Buhari leaves office. And it is the borrowing conversation. Do you anticipate a situation where maybe in his first year, President-elect Tinubu can avoid borrowing? Or is the next president of Nigeria tied to the borrowing cycle, but maybe having to do it in a slightly different way?
I mean, thank you so much, Tolulope. Personal views aside, trying to be objective now in the context of the way forward, vis-a-vis what we have or who we know as the current president-elect. If you take a look at his track record in terms of revenue mobilization, he's done well in that regard in Lagos State. So we're likely to see a replication of that scale, because there is first a revenue crisis to start with. So I think it's likely going to take off from there, because you probably want to start with areas or things you can control, before you now begin to deal with what you can't control, or the unknown factors and all that, or the larger wide-scale variables. So I think he's going to probably rework his revenue mobilization strategy. He's largely known around taxes and taxation and sort of building some structure around more tax collection. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a review in the Finance Act, as the case may be, going forward, if that will still hold water. So revenues are a key part, and the method of collecting revenue or mobilizing revenue would be a key thing that we need to look out for with the new administration. Secondly, would be that they may not be able to completely fizzle out the fact that they would need debt finance. I mean, quite honestly, we've had a history of poor use of debt financing, which has been the main issue itself, not just the debt. I mean, the UK is also facing the public debt challenge. United States also faced the public debt challenge, but we've seen that there are much more relaxed concessions around servicing these debts and all of that. And we've seen that there's more bias, for emerging or frontier or struggling economies or vulnerable economies to pay higher rates in terms of servicing. It's just how the international economics of things work. So for Nigeria, the question will now be, how will the incoming president begin to manage the dynamics of debt financing for his developmental aspirations? quote and unquote. Secondly, how would he probably begin to renegotiate debt deals, in such a way that it doesn't also sort of backfire or becomes counterproductive to his new revenue mobilization scheme, as the case may be. So those are interesting things I would also begin to look out for in the debt market, and also probably ways that he may want to think of raising finance, alternative financing sources, to some of Nigeria's developmental financing needs as well. I'm also looking at for more creative ways around that, because what he did in Lagos in terms of public finance technically changed the game of things nationally. So we're trying to see how we'll be able to replicate that within the context of fiscal policies, as he steps into office, if that be the case, yeah.
Okay, so we know that debt servicing is not the only drain on Nigeria's finances. Petrol subsidy is also expected to cost Nigeria some 6.7 trillion naira, or about $7.5 billion this year. Now, while he was campaigning, and in many comments, Bola Ahmed Tinubu has said that he finds the petrol subsidy to be anti-poor and that it must go. In fact, he said that it had actually caged the petrol or the oil industry. He said he would get rid of it if he was elected. He also mentioned unbundling the oil sector. Is there an easy way to get rid of subsidy? We've gone round and round and round this subsidy issue. We've agreed that many administrations have unfortunately actually pushed it down, as they say, kicked the can down the road. But now the can has hit a wall. There's nowhere further for this subsidy conversation to go, and a decision must be made. And he has said if elected, he will get rid of it. He has now been elected. In May, we're possibly expecting to hear a plan as to how the Tinubu administration expects to get rid of subsidy. Is there an easy way to do this?
Thank you, Dr. Tolulope. There are tensions and perception that he would be a bit aggressive with his policies, especially give or take with the current state of things. Things are really, really bad. So he may likely become very aggressive with the use of his policies, and those fears are very valid. But then you want to look at what's the impact of that on the market, consumer spending, and investor confidence, and the overall outlook for the economy. That's a very big question on the table if he chooses to go the aggressive route. But it's also safe to say that Nigerians have started paying higher amounts for fuel, give or take whether subsidy is there or not. With the current fuel scarcity, we've seen states where people are buying a liter for 700 naira. I don't know if you've heard of that as well. We've seen where people are buying a liter for about 500 because of the fuel scarcity. So technically, that's what we would sort of begin to experience in large scale if the subsidy is taken out. My perception is that he may want to take it out at once, But then again, there is need to sort of introduce some phased removal, if any. But more importantly for me would be, and which is one thing that I think all of the campaign conversations, the manifesto conversations lacked, is the argument is really not to take out subsidy. The argument is to fix power. Because if you have energy and alternative energy means that is made inclusive for the average Nigerian, then we're likely going to reduce the demand on PMS, crude oil, kerosene, as the case may be. And once you relax the demand there, then you would not technically have to talk about subsidy, if at all it still exists. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say. Currently, about 60 to 70% of demand for PMS and weekly demand for kerosene and diesel comes from households and businesses who have cars, who need fuel to power their generators at home, who need diesel to power the generators at work, in terms of SMEs and all of that. Now, if you reduce or fix power by 50% or create alternative energy by 50% at least, that means you would have slashed 50% of that demand on this. Now, because we do not produce these items locally and local demand is also high, that has also over time increased the need for, to look for supply elsewhere, which is sort of importing PMS and petroleum products and paying significant amounts of money because of the volume that needs to be imported as a result of the high local demand. So once demand is slashed by 50 to 70 to 80%, there will technically be a reduction in the amount of PMS that needs to be imported. And that would technically mean that a slash drop in what it will cost us, to purchase these items from firms and institutions in Europe that we engage. So I would want us to probably look at the big picture, and that would be my encouragement to the new administration to really go aggressive. That aggression to take out subsidy should also be used in fixing power and providing inclusive energy sources so that you drop that demand for life and we do not have to revisit this conversation of subsidy again.
Hopefully not. All right. So some analysts have listed 5 traps that await the next president, and I've taken 2 of them. That's the debt servicing conversation as well as fuel subsidy. But there are also some other issues. There's the conversation around the burden of rising ways and means advances. Now, we know that fresh criticism trailed the decision by the Buhari administration to convert at least 20 trillion naira, that's about $45.4 billion of loans taken from the CBN to 40-year bonds. There's also the crude for cash deal. Now, despite declining oil production, the Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited has entered into cash for crude deals worth about $5.6 billion with some of its business partners. And rounding up the 5 traps is the rainy day fund and the fact that it's almost depleted. In a season where other major oil producers like Saudi Arabia and even small producers like Guyana and Bahrain are laughing all the way to the bank due to higher oil prices, Nigeria has struggled to benefit from surging crude prices due to pipeline theft and years of underinvestment that have limited oil exports. The Nigerian government's reason has also complicated his response. On Buhari's watch, fuel subsidies and big-ticket projects have sapped state coffers, including the excess crude accounts in recent weeks and years. So if you look at these 5 quote-unquote traps that are awaiting the president, you notice that all of them have the administration outgoing spending massive amounts of money for things that in ways should have been provided locally. In terms of the rising way and means advances, that's going to be on the table for the Tinubu administration when they enter. What do you think we should be expecting on that?
Yes, I mean, these concerns are really valid. These concerns are really, really valid. But if you look at all these concerns, I mean, they are hinged on the fact that there are core structural challenges across board in the Nigerian economy. And having built an economy on dysfunctionalities, that would have meant that NDAs are wired to be dysfunctional. Nigerian budgetary spending or fiscal engagements are wired as well to be unproductive and dysfunctional. And as a result, you begin to see the debt servicing conversations, you begin to see the revenue, lack of revenue mobilization, all those layers of dysfunctionality were built by structural elements of dysfunctionalities and institutions who are also extractive in their ideology. So that is just the major solution in terms of sustainable pathway to dealing across will be fixing the structural issues. Again, that would be if the president-elect, runs on an inclusive-driven ideology. If he runs on that inclusive-driven ideology and he sets up a team that runs on those similar ideologies, they should be able to reduce leakages and begin to fix the structural and productive elements that would help us, build new layers of effective revenue mobilization, proper market especially for MSMEs. And by the time we begin to put all these things together, there's going to be a relaxation of all these issues. I think there are also concerns around the softer elements, of the president-elect in terms of how would he manage cultural issues and misalignments. How would he probably build some form of unity in the midst of disorderliness or disunity or division that currently exists, and the tensions and perceived tensions around his government, when it comes to disunity and all of that. So those tensions, I think, in my humble opinion, have more to do and in terms of impacting the quality of his governance and results than just the 5 items you've listed. I didn't even get what I'm trying to say.
Yes.
So there are bigger issues that needs to be dealt with by the current president, and all of these narratives have to probably be built around sincerity, honesty, and transparency to deal across, because these tensions are valid, these concerns are valid, and any misconception around them could really, self-destruct Nigeria. So, as the case may be right now, I mean, if we continue in this regard and these softer elements are not dealt with,
they may make the harder elements too. Yes. Okay, so there's a question I want to ask. Because you referenced Tinubu's time as 2-term governor in Lagos State. We know that many people credit him with getting the state through the time where former President Olusegun Obasanjo was actually depriving the state of its due allocations and also helping to build it after it was abandoned for Abuja to then become the Federal Capital Territory. But this is asking you to sort of, what would you define as his economic body language. We've seen with the previous administration, there's a bit of socialism in sort of how the direction led by the president has taken. Are we looking at a free market capitalist? Are we looking at somebody who is likely to combine elements of capitalism and a bit of socialism to deal with rising poverty and 200 million population in Nigeria? How would you sort of define his economic body language, given that we can use his 8 years as in Lagos and many of his comments to sort of bring about that definition? Very quickly before I get to my last question.
Top of mind, I would think of a managed capitalism approach. Yeah, so I would think of a managed and carefully using the word managed around that, a managed capitalism approach. So I won't be surprised to see some very aggressive policies that may not speak to the critical mass, but, would speak to a much more relatively significant people who can probably break into those nets. So it's going to be very relative and it's a developing story, but I see more around a managed capitalism approach. I do not necessarily see a free market capitalist approach. I do not necessarily see that, but to a very large extent, may not be also a socialist approach, but a managed capitalist approach, on the best case scenario, and a socialist approach on the worst case scenario.
Okay, so Gospel, before I let you go, the 100 days is often touted as this sort of benchmark. And while it's very difficult to know what a 4-year term will really look like in the first 100 days, I'll use that to wrap this conversation up. Time is really of the essence for Nigeria at this point in time. What are you thinking the president-elect will need to deal with? The top 3 economic issues that you expect to see action on within the first 100 days that he assumes office?
I think number one will be to fix security. That would be number one, fix the concerns around security in the nation. Number 2 will be to build social infrastructure. So, on one end of things, all of the hard infrastructure that needs to go into economic productivity has to be done. Then all of the values, ideology, and institutional approach or framework designed that enabling those infrastructure to deliver also needs to go up. If you lose the soft infrastructure and focus on the hard infrastructure, the overall infrastructure block will not deliver. So Nigeria has come to a position where both infrastructure blocks have to be properly aligned, and that's going to be a lot unstable to deal. On the first block, that will be developing human capital and expanding markets. Those 2 things are very critical. Nigeria and Nigerians need to begin to do more within the regional and global space with a defined tactical approach and sort of repositioning for the non-oil sector in that regard. I think with those top 3 elements, built on, structural reforms to a very large extent, built on structural reforms, we'll begin to see some major changes. That's on the assumption that the structure of his government will be tailored and designed, to deliver those changes to start with.
All right, we still have some time, and we do expect in the coming weeks to possibly hear more about the formation of his cabinet and those who will be driving his economic plans and policies. And when we know that, we'll also be having more conversations. Gospel Obele, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Tolu, for having me.